She was lying in the dirt when the helicopter came, not waiting for it, not praying toward the sound of rotors cutting through the hot Afghan air. Just lying on her back, with her left leg wrapped in a tourniquet, she had applied herself blood-soaking through the field dressing, in a slow dark bloom, talking into the radio, with the calm voice of someone reading a weather report. Reeves, take your 3 south, use the dry creek bed. Stay low, the ridge on your left is clear. They watched it for 11 minutes and there's nothing moving up there. Go now while the smoke is still thick. Static then, Reeves's voice rough and breathless. Callahan, are you? I'm fine, go. She was not fine, but fine was not the point. The helicopter came in low over the ridge. She watched it descend without moving, without reaching up, without making herself any easier to find. The rotors threw dust across her face. She closed her eyes against it, kept the radio pressed to her ear, and listened to the sound of her team moving to safety. When the last of them confirmed extraction, she let out one slow breath through her nose. Then she set the radio down in the dirt beside her and looked up at the pale morning sky over Helmand Province. She was 26 years old. She had both hands free. That was what she had planned for. That was what everything had cost. 15 years later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in rural Virginia, a retired Rear Admiral named Raymond Holt would open an envelope with no return address and read a document that would unravel everything he thought he knew about that day, about that woman, about what she had done and why she had done it, and what it had taken from her. But that morning came later. First, you have to understand who she was before anyone else did. 26 years earlier. Montana, 1983. Arden Mae Callahan came into the world on a February morning so cold, the midwife's hands went numb twice during the delivery. Her father, Silas Callahan, stood in the hallway of the small hospital in Billings, with his back against the wall and his hands in his pockets, waiting the way Marines wait. Still, alert, ready for orders that might not come. When the nurse finally opened the door and told him he had a daughter, he nodded once and followed her inside. His wife Nora was holding the baby against her chest, exhausted and pale and smiling in a way Silas had never seen before. Something fierce and complete. He sat down beside the bed. He looked at his daughter, 6 pounds, 8 ounces, dark hair, eyes closed, breathing. She's perfect, Nora said. Silas reached out one hand and touched the baby's head with his fingertips. The gesture was careful, almost hesitant, the way a man touches something he has been trained not to break. Yeah, he said quietly, she is. He did not know yet what he would teach her. He did not know yet that the thing growing in his chest as he sat there, the thing that felt like hope and terror in equal measure, would one day require him to put everything he knew into the hands of this 6-pound person and trust that she would know what to do with it when the moment came. He only knew that he would do whatever it took to make sure she could stand in the world and not break under the weight of it. That was enough for now. 11 years later, on a Saturday afternoon in October, Silas Callahan took his daughter to the back of their property and taught her how to hold a rifle. The property was 23 acres at the end of a gravel road, most of it open grassland that ran up against the foothills east of Billings. The house was small and practical, built by someone who understood that Montana winters were not theoretical. In the summer, you could see the Beartooth Range from the kitchen window. In the winter, you could see nothing but white. Silas had been out of active duty for 2 years, working as a firearms instructor at a private range 40 minutes south of town. He was 38 years old. He had served 14 years in the Marine Corps, 6 of them with reconnaissance battalions, 2 deployments to the Gulf, 1 to Somalia. His hands were calloused in specific places. He sat with his back to the wall in restaurants. He checked every room he entered for exits. Nora understood these things without needing them explained. She had married him when he was 24, and she was 23, both of them young enough to believe love could carry the weight of anything. It mostly could. The parts it could not carry, they learned to set down carefully and step around. Arden was 11 years old, tall for her age, elbows and knees, and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that swung when she walked. She followed her father across the dry October grass with the easy stride of a kid who had spent her whole life in open country. Silas stopped at a fence post 200 yards from the house. He set down the rifle case he was carrying and looked at his daughter. You know what this is about, he said. It was not a question. Arden looked at the case, then at her father. Yeah, He opened the case. Inside was a Remington 700 bolt action point .308 caliber, the stock worn smooth in places. From years of use, he lifted it out and checked the chamber. Empty. He handed it to Arden. It was heavier than she expected. She took it with both hands and held it the way she had seen him hold tools in the garage, careful and attentive. Silas watched her adjust her grip, finding the balance. He said nothing yet. He was waiting to see what her hands would do before her mind told them what to do. After a moment, she shifted the rifle to her shoulder. Awkward, but not wrong. Her left hand came up under the barrel. Her right hand settled near the trigger guard finger along the outside. Silas nodded. Good. Now put it down and listen. She lowered the rifle and looked at him. I'm going to teach you this, he said, because the world is not always going to offer you a choice about what your hands need to do. And if that moment comes, I want you to be ready. I want your hands to know what to do, even when your brain is too scared to think straight. He paused. This is not about making you a warrior. This is not about making you anything. This is about giving you something you can use if you ever need it. And I hope to God you never do. Arden held his gaze. She was 11 years old, but she had learned early not to look away when her father was saying something that mattered. Okay, she said. Silas picked up the rifle. He showed her how to load it, how to settle the stock against her shoulder, how to find the sight picture through the scope. He showed her how to breathe. In for 4 counts. Hold. Press the trigger during the hold, smooth and even, no jerk, no anticipation. He showed her all of this in the same voice he used to explain how to change a tire or split firewood. Calm, methodical, no wasted words. Then he let her try. The first shot went wide, 6 inches left of the target. Arden pulled her face away from the scope, frowning. Silas crouched beside her. What happened? I pulled it. Why, she thought about it. I was thinking about the recoil. He nodded. That's the problem. You can't think about what happens after. You think about the breath and the press and nothing else. The after takes care of itself. She tried again. This time the round hit 4 inches high and 2 inches right. Better. Still not centered. Silas did not tell her it was good. He told her to try again. By the time the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the temperature started falling, Arden had put 11 rounds into a 10-inch group at 200 yards. Not perfect, not consistent, but her hands were learning. Silas collected the brass and packed the rifle. Arden stood beside him, quiet, her arms tired from holding the weight. How do you feel? He asked. Tired. Good. That means you were holding it right. They walked back toward the house. The evening light stretched long across the grass, turning everything gold and cold at the same time. Halfway back, Arden said, Dad, yeah, why'd you really teach me that? Today, Silas kept walking. He did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than it had been all afternoon. Because I won't always be here to do the things that need doing. And when I'm not, I want to know you can take care of yourself. She looked up at him. Where are you going? Nowhere right now, but someday I will be. That's just how it works. Arden walked a few more steps in silence. Then she said, okay. And that was enough. 3 years later, in the summer of 1997, Arden Callahan put 3 rounds through the same hole at 600 yards with a coal barrel in a 15-mile-per-hour crosswind. Her father stood behind her with his arms crossed, watching through a spotting scope. He did not say anything when she finished. He just marked the target, pulled it down, and handed it to her. She looked at the tight cluster, 3 impacts overlapping so closely they formed a single ragged tear in the paper. That's good, she said. Silas looked at her. Then he looked at the target. Then he adjusted the scope on the rifle and set it up again, this time aimed at a steel plate 700 yards out. Again, he said. She shot again. The steel rang clear across the valley, the sound delayed by distance, arriving a full second after the impact. Silas lowered the spotting scope. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. She was 14 years old, 5'6", 120 pounds. She had just demonstrated a level of marksmanship that most adults never reached. He should have been proud. He was. But what he felt more than pride was a deep and growing certainty that he had given her something she would one day need to use, and that the day she needed it would cost her in ways he could not protect her from. He folded the spotting scope and put it in the case. You're done for today, he said. Arden frowned. I've only been shooting for 20 minutes. I know. She waited for more explanation. When none came, she asked, did I do something wrong? No. You did it right. That's the problem. He picked up the rifle and started walking back toward the truck. Arden followed, confused but unwilling to push. She had learned that her father's silences meant something and that sometimes the best thing to do was let them sit. That night after dinner, Silas went to his workshop at the back of the garage. It was a small space 12 by 10 with a workbench along one wall and shelves lined with tools and parts and notebooks. He kept the notebooks in a drawer under the bench, spiral-bound, filled with cramped left-handed writing. Range notes, wind corrections, ballistic tables, the accumulated knowledge of 15 years spent learning how to put a bullet exactly where it needed to go. He opened the most recent notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. Below it, he wrote Arden, 600 yards, 3-round group, cold barrel, 15 miles per hour cross. Perfect execution. He stared at the words for a moment. Then he added, "She's carrying something most people don't get to carry. I don't know what it's going to ask of her. I hope I'm there when it does." He closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. Then he sat in the quiet workshop for a long time thinking about the future and all the ways a father could prepare his child for it and all the ways that preparation would never be enough. 6 years later, in March of 2003, Gunnery Sergeant Silas Callahan sat in a tent in northern Kuwait and wrote a letter to his daughter. He was 47 years old. This was his fourth deployment since returning to active duty in 2001, his second to the Middle East. The air outside the tent was dry and hot, even at night, the kind of heat that settled into your lungs and made breathing feel like work. The tent was quiet. Most of the platoon was asleep. The few who were awake sat in small clusters cleaning weapons or writing their own letters or playing cards under the dim portable lights. Silas sat alone at the end of a folding table with a notebook open in front of him and a pen in his left hand. He had started the letter 3 times already. Each time he had crossed out the opening and started over, unsatisfied with the tone. Too formal, too casual, too aware of what he was trying to say and too careful about saying it. Finally, he stopped trying to control it and just wrote, "Hey kid, it's late here, around 200, can't sleep, so I figured I'd do something useful with the hours between midnight and dawn. We're in Kuwait right now, waiting on orders to move north. It's hot. Everything is sand. There's a card game going on 3 tables over with guys from another platoon, and there's a pump that wandered onto the base last week and decided the sergeant major is its personal human. Sleeps on his boots every night. He acts annoyed, but I've seen him sneak at food twice. I'm telling you these things because I want you to know the people I'm with. Mason from Tennessee, who can't stop talking about his kid. Harris from Oregon, who reads paperback westerns and leaves them everywhere. Cooper, who plays guitar badly but with confidence. They're good men. You'd like them. Now I'm going to tell you something I haven't told your mother and probably won't. I need you to hold on to it the way I taught you to hold a breath before a shot, without forcing it. Just let it sit. You're going to have a day. I don't know when. I don't know what it looks like. But you're going to have a day where everything I taught you becomes the difference between somebody going home and somebody not going home. I know this the same way I knew when you were 12 years old, and I watched you put 3 rounds through the same hole at 600 yards with a cold barrel, that you were carrying something not everyone gets to carry. When that day comes, use it. Don't think about the promise. Don't think about your mother. Your mother's promise was made by a woman who was afraid, and she's right to be afraid because fear is what keeps the people we love alive. But fear is also the thing that will keep you standing at the edge of what you're capable of instead of crossing over. Use it, and then come home and call your mother, and she will be angry, and then she will understand because she is the toughest woman I have ever known, and she understands more than she lets on. I love you more than I can say in a letter, and I've never been good at saying it out loud. So I'll leave it at this. Dad." He read it over once, then he folded it carefully, put it in an envelope, and wrote Arden's name and their home address on the front. He did not seal it yet. Instead, he sat for another few minutes thinking. Then he opened his footlocker and pulled out a small item wrapped in electrical tape. A USB drive, thumbnail size, the kind of thing you could carry for years before anyone noticed. He had loaded it 2 days ago with 26 photographs, a 47-second audio file, and 3 pages of handwritten field notes. The kind of documentation a Marine Recon operator made when he saw something that did not match its stated architecture and understood that information worth keeping was information worth hiding. He had seen a CIA officer meeting with a man he did not recognize in a part of the base that was technically off limits to most personnel. He had seen it happen 3 times over the course of a week. He had taken photographs from a distance using a camera borrowed from the intelligence section. He had recorded part of one conversation through a window that was supposed to be closed. He did not have a name for what he was seeing yet. He only knew it was wrong and that the people who should have been noticing it were not, and that if something happened because of it, no one would believe him unless he had proof. So he made proof. And now he was sending it home sealed inside a letter to his daughter hidden in a package that would look like nothing more than a father writing to his family. He taped the USB drive to the inside of the envelope, resealed it, and set it aside. Then he wrote a second letter, this one to Nora, shorter and lighter, about the bum and the card game and how much he missed her coffee. He would send both letters in the morning. For now, he closed the notebook, turned off the light, and lay down on his cot. Outside, the Kuwaiti night was vast and silent. Somewhere in the future, his daughter would open that envelope and find the thing he had left for her, and she would know what to do with it. He had to believe that. It was all he had. 19 months later, on a cold morning in November 2004, 2 uniformed officers knocked on the door of a small house at the end of a gravel road in Billings, Montana. Nora Callahan opened the door. She knew what they were there to say before they said it. She had known it the moment she saw the dark sedan pull up the driveway. She had known it in the particular way the taller officer took off his cap. She had known it in the silence that came before the words. Mrs. Callahan. I regret to inform you, she did not hear the rest. She stood in the doorway and looked past the officers to the driveway, to the empty space where Silas's truck should have been, and she felt the floor of her life drop out from under her in a way that was both sudden and inevitable. The officers were professional and kind. They said the things they had been trained to say. They offered the things they had been trained to offer. Contact information, casualty assistance, resources. Nora thanked them, then she closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long time, not moving, not crying, just standing. Arden came home 20 minutes later. She had been at a friend's house studying for a history exam. She was 21 years old in her 3rd year at Montana State Home for the weekend. She saw the sedan, still parked at the end of the driveway. She saw her mother standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. She stopped in the doorway. Mom Nora turned. Her face was pale and blank, the expression of someone who had taken a blow so large they had not yet begun to feel it. Your father, she said, and that was all she needed to say. Arden stood very still. She did not ask for details. She did not ask how or where or when. She already knew the only thing that mattered. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her mother, and the two of them stood there in the quiet house while the Montana afternoon turned cold outside, and the world rearranged itself into something they would have to learn how to live in. 2 days later, Nora found Arden standing at the back of the property by the fence post where Silas had first taught her to shoot. Arden was not holding a rifle. She was just standing there, looking out at the open grassland, her hands in the pockets of her jacket. Nora walked out across the dry November ground and stood beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Nora said, I need you to promise me something. Arden looked at her. No more guns, Nora said. Her voice was flat and exhausted, the voice of a woman who had already decided the answer before she asked the question. Promise me. Whatever you do with your life, whatever you become, not that, not this. I cannot watch this again. Arden looked at her mother's face. She saw 20 years of waiting, 20 years of watching a man leave every 18 months and come back different, 20 years of loving someone who carried things he could not set down. She saw all of it, and she said, I promise. She meant it. She joined the Navy the following spring. United States Navy Hospital Corpsman School, Great Lakes, Illinois. Spring 2005. Arden Callahan was 22 years old, 5'7", 135 pounds. She had steady hands, a high tolerance for stress, and the kind of focused intensity that her instructors noted in their evaluations as unusual for her age. She excelled in emergency trauma medicine. She stayed calm when other trainees froze. She had the rare ability to narrow her entire world to the problem directly in front of her and ignore everything else until that problem was solved. Nobody knew why. She never told them. By the end of the 16-week course, she had the highest practical scores in her class. Her written exams were solid. Her evaluations were clean, no behavioral issues, no complaints, no gaps. She graduated in August and received orders to Field Medical Training Battalion, Camp Pendleton, California, for advanced training with Marine units. She spent 6 months learning combat medicine in conditions designed to replicate the chaos of actual combat. Live fire exercises, simulated casualties, scenarios where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and the only thing that mattered was whether you could keep someone alive long enough to get them to a surgeon. Arden kept them alive. All of them, her instructors noticed. So did the Marines she trained with. One of them, a staff sergeant named Vickers, pulled her aside after a particularly brutal drill and said, "You're good at this." Arden wiped blood simulated but realistic off her hands and shrugged. "It's the job." "No," Vickers said. "You're good at this the way some people are good at music, like it's built in." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But she thought about it later, lying in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Built in. Maybe it was. Maybe her father had put it there one afternoon at a time, one lesson at a time, until her hands knew things her mind had not yet learned to articulate. Or maybe it had always been there, and he had just shown her how to use it. Either way, it was hers now, and she was going to use it the way he had taught her to use everything else. With precision, with purpose, and without hesitation when the moment came. By 2009, Petty Officer Second Class Arden Callahan had 2 deployments behind her. One to Iraq, embedded with a Marine infantry company during the surge. One to Afghanistan, attached to a forward surgical team in Helmand Province. She had 53 confirmed lives saved in combat conditions. Tourniquets applied under fire. Chest decompressions performed in the back of moving vehicles. Airways secured while rounds impacted 30 feet away. She had been awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal twice. She had never been officially wounded. She had also not touched a firearm in 5 years. She kept that promise, right up until the moment she had to break it. July 2009, Forward Operating Base, Dwyer, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The heat hit like a physical object the moment you stepped off the aircraft. 112 degrees Fahrenheit in the early afternoon. The kind of heat that made metal too hot to touch and turned the air above the ground into a shimmer that bent the horizon into something untrustworthy. The kind of heat that killed you in layers. First your judgment, then your patience, then your will. Arden Callahan stepped off the CH-47 with 87 pounds of medical equipment on her back and a service record that had cleared every background check ever run on her. She was 26 years old. She was here because the SEAL element she was being attached to had lost their previous corpsman to a fractured radius 4 days ago, and they needed a replacement before their next operation. She showed up at the forward operating base at 0600, found the team briefing room, and introduced herself to the 7 men who would be her world for the next rotation. Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, 34 years old, calm, methodical, the kind of officer who inspired confidence by never asking his men to do anything he had not already done himself. Chief Garrett Stone, 29 years old, built like someone who had spent his entire adult life carrying heavy things over long distances. He looked at Arden when she walked in, glanced at Reeves, and raised his eyebrows in a way that did not require translation. Reeves ignored him, and Petty Officer First Class Decker Nash, 24 years old, 18 months into his first deployment, eager, competent, still young enough to believe skill could substitute for experience, and Senior Chief Owen Drake, 41 years old, 17 years in special operations. Weathered face, quiet eyes, the kind of man who had stopped registering surprise about anything several years ago. Arden introduced herself to each of them. Firm handshake, direct eye contact, no attempt to fill the silence with explanation or apology for being what she was. Then she found a corner of the briefing room, sat down with her medical kit, and began a systematic inventory. Not because she needed to. She had inventoried it twice on the flight in. She did it because she needed to see how these men reacted to a woman who did not react to them. Drake watched her from across the room. He watched her sort through her kit with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He watched her hands specifically. He noted the absence of wasted motion. He noted the angle of her head as she checked each item checking, but also listening, aware of the room around her without appearing to monitor it. He had seen that combination of awareness and stillness in exactly one other category of person. He filed it away and said nothing. The first operation was a reconnaissance insertion 3 kilometers south of a suspected cache site. Low risk, primarily surveillance, intended to establish line-of-sight observation positions before the main approach. Reeves assembled his element assignments that morning in the back of a Humvee with a terrain map folded across his knees. Callahan, he said, without looking up, "You're holding at the primary rally point with Nash. Support element." It was not an insult. It was standard doctrine for an attached corpsman on a first operation with a new team. You did not push an unknown asset into a forward position until you had baseline data on how they operated. Arden said, "Yes, sir." Stone, checking his M4 across the vehicle, glanced up. "You good with that, Doc?" He said it with a particular inflection that was not quite a question. "Stay him back where it's comfortable." Arden finished retaping the grip on her sidearm. "I'm good wherever you need me." Stone held her gaze for a moment. "Just checking." "Some people—" "I'm good," Arden said. The flatness in her voice was not anger. It was the conversational equivalent of a door closing. Stone opened his mouth, read something in her expression that gave him brief pause, and went back to his rifle. Drake, 3 feet away, had watched the whole exchange. He turned back to his own equipment and allowed himself a small, private adjustment of his prior assessment. The operation was textbook. They were back at the FOB by 0200. Nothing fired, nothing compromised. Arden spent the duration at the rally point monitoring the radio, maintaining the medical station, running her inventory for a third time. When Reeves came back through the checkpoint, she handed him a written sitrep on the condition of all personnel. None injured, Nash showing early signs of dehydration. Recommend extra fluids before next operation. He took the paper, read it, looked at her for the first time as something other than a logistical variable. He did not say anything, but he kept the paper. The second operation went 3 kilometers further north and included a narrow passage through a section of dried riverbed that funneled the team into single file for approximately 200 meters. Too linear, no lateral cover. The only thing you could do was move fast and trust your flanks. Reeves put Arden at position 4 in the column, not at the back, not at the rally point. Position 4, Stone noticed. He saved his reaction for later when the team was eating in the briefing room and Reeves was on a call with command. "Interesting call today," Stone said, not to anyone specifically, putting the doc in the stack. Nash looked up from his food. "She did fine." "She did nothing. That's the problem. She's a passenger in a stack. She's a liability." "She kept pace," Drake said. "Barely. Actually, Drake said she was maintaining interval better than Nash." Stone set down his fork. "Whose side are you on?" "The side of whoever does the job." "Right," Drake said. He picked up his coffee. "You should try it." Arden was at the far end of the table. She had heard every word. She ate her food and said nothing. And when she was done, she washed her own plate and went to check on the medical status of the team, which was required, and said nothing about the conversation, which was a choice. It was during the pre-operation equipment check for the third mission that Drake watched Arden's hands for the first time with full attention. The team was running checks in the staging area. Drake's Barrett M82A1 was laid out on a table. 30 pounds of precision engineering, a rifle capable of reaching out 800 meters and beyond in the right hands. He had stepped away briefly to address a comms issue. When he came back, Arden was standing near the table, not touching the rifle. Close. Then Nash called to her about something, and she reached out to step around the table, and her left hand came down on the bipod leg to steady it as she passed. An automatic gesture. The kind of thing you do without thinking when you are familiar with an object. And the hand that came down on that bipod adjusted its angle. Not by much. 3 degrees, maybe 4. But it was the right 3 degrees for the elevation of their target area. And it was done without looking, without measuring, without any apparent conscious thought. Drake stood absolutely still. Arden moved around the table and went to answer Nash's question. And Drake stood there looking at the adjusted bipod for a moment longer, feeling the quiet arrival of a certainty he could not yet explain. He picked up the Barrett and carried it with him the rest of the evening. The third mission changed something. It was the deepest insertion yet, nearly 4 kilometers from the nearest coalition support position. Moving through terrain that Drake had spent 40 minutes studying on satellite imagery and still did not fully trust. The valley had too many angles. The ridgelines were too high. They were 90 minutes into the approach when Nash stumbled, not from the terrain, Something in his chest had gone wrong and his body had been compensating for it quietly for the last 40 minutes, and now it had run out of compensation. He went down on one knee. Arden was beside him before anyone else had processed what was happening. She put her hand on his neck first. Pulse check. Then she leaned in and looked at his face. The slight bluish cast to the skin around his lips. The shallow asymmetrical breathing. The way his left side barely moved when he inhaled. "Stop," she said quietly, and the column stopped. Reeves moved back. "What is it? Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in his chest cavity. His left lung is being compressed. If we keep moving, he goes into cardiac arrest within 10 to 15 minutes. Stone said he was fine an hour ago. He was compensating an hour ago." She pulled out a 14-gauge needle catheter. "He's done compensating. I need 60 seconds, and I need quiet." Reeves looked at the terrain around them, made a tactical calculation. "You've got it." Stone watched her work with the expression of a man recalculating something he had already decided. She found the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line without hesitation. The needle went in. There was an audible release of pressure. Nash gasped, and then his breathing deepened and evened out, and the color began returning to his face. 45 seconds from diagnosis to stabilization. Drake crouched next to Arden as she taped the needle in place. He kept his voice below the wind. "How'd you catch that?" His gait changed about 40 minutes ago. Slight lean to the left when he breathed. "I've been watching it for 40 minutes. I wanted to be sure. I didn't want to stop the mission over a hypothesis. Most medics would have pulled the plug at the first sign." "I'm not most medics." She closed her kit. "Tell Reeves." That evening in the briefing room, something had shifted. Not in anything anyone said, in the way they held themselves when she was in the room. The way Stone no longer looked to Reeves for confirmation before accepting her presence in the space. The way Nash, sitting with a bandage on his chest and better color in his face than he had had all day, watched her move across the room with an expression that was simple and complete. She had pulled him back from something he had not even known was coming. He would not forget that. The night before the fourth mission, Drake found her sitting outside the wire at the edge of the compound, looking out at the dark hills. He sat down beside her arm. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Drake said, "Your father was Marine Recon." Arden was quiet for a moment. "That's in my file, not in your file. I know someone who served with him in the 90s. When I saw your name on the transfer order, I asked around." She kept her eyes on the ridgeline. "He died in Fallujah," she said. "November 2004. "I know." Drake paused. "He was a hell of a shot." "That's what they said." She did not answer. "He'd teach you." The questions sat between them for a long time. "He taught me a lot of things," she finally said. Drake nodded slowly. "You adjusted my bipod yesterday." Her jaw tightened just a fraction. "I bumped it when I was walking by. I was just Callahan." His voice was not unkind. "I set the bipod myself that morning. I know exactly what angle it was at. What you set it to was the correct adjustment for our target elevation and distance. That's not a bump, that's a calculation." She said nothing. Drake stood, looked out at the same ridgeline she had been watching. Tomorrow is going to be different from the others. Be ready for things to change fast. He walked back inside. Arden sat alone in the dark for another 20 minutes. Her hands rested on her knees. Still, the night before the fifth mission, Drake set a folder on the table beside her and left without a word. She opened it. It was a supplemental entry from a Marine Corps internal review. 1991 Operation Desert Storm. An incident involving Corporal Silas Callahan, Marine Recon, and a three-man element pinned down during a reconnaissance push near the Iraqi border. She read it twice. The review was brief and dry and formal, and it managed despite itself to contain something true. Silas Callahan had been part of a four-man element. A lance corporal named Webb had been shot during a firefight down in an exposed position with a femoral artery wound that required immediate intervention or he would not survive conventional extraction. Silas had left his covered position. He had crossed 40 meters of exposed ground under fire. He had been shot in the process a round through his left calf, and he had continued working, and Webb had survived, and both had been evacuated. The final line noted that prior to deployment, Corporal Callahan had made a documented personal commitment to his father, a retired Marine Master Sergeant, that he would not take unnecessary risks in the field. The events of March 9, 1991 constituted a breach of that commitment. She set the folder down. She sat with it for a long time. Her father had not given her an impossible standard. He had given her his own. He had done exactly what he would one day ask of her, and he had survived it. And then he had spent the rest of his life putting everything he had learned in those 40 meters into her hands. Not as burden, as preparation. She thought about the letter. She went to her kit and took it out. She had carried it since the day she opened his effects, worn soft at the folds, the paper gone thin where her fingers always found it. Silas Callahan's handwriting was cramped and leftward, the writing of a man who had learned to hold a pen wrong and never corrected it because it worked fine that way. The letter was dated March 4, 2003, written from Kuwait on a night when he apparently could not sleep and had decided to do something useful with the hours between midnight and dawn. She read the parts she had memorized years ago. When that day comes, use it. Don't think about the promise. Don't think about your mother. Use it and then come home and call your mother, and she will be angry, and then she will understand because she is the toughest woman I have ever known, and she understands more than she lets on. She folded the letter back along its worn creases and put it in the inner pocket of her jacket. She thought about the USB drive she had carried since the day she found it inside the watch that came home with his effects, sealed in electrical tape, the size of a thumbnail. The kind of thing you could carry for years before anyone noticed. She had not opened it. She had not been ready. She was beginning to understand that she would need to be. Outside the compound was quiet. Someone was on radio watch. A generator hummed in the distance. The Helmand night was enormous and still full of the particular waiting quality that nights before operations always carried. Tomorrow was the day her father had written about. She could feel it the way she could feel weather coming in over the mountains at home. Not a thought, not a calculation, but a knowing that lived in the body before it arrived in the mind. She closed her eyes. She was ready. The briefing at 0500 on July 14th was shorter than usual. Reeves stood at the table with the terrain map and walked through the grid in the flat, methodical voice he used when he had already processed his own concern about a mission and was presenting only the operational facts. The gap between those two versions of his voice was larger than usual. The objective was a confirmed command node operating out of a compound 4 kilometers northeast of their current position. Intelligence placed 2 mid-level Taliban logistics coordinators at the site with a rotating security element of 8 to 12 fighters. The insertion would follow the northern ridgeline drop into the valley through a dry creek bed, and the element would hold observation positions while a strike package was coordinated overhead. Reeves said this was not a direct action mission. They were going in to watch and confirm not to engage. He said it the way a man says something he needs to be on record as having said. Arden studied the terrain map. The valley was narrower than the one they had worked 5 days before. The creek bed approach was good for concealment, but it channeled the element into a linear formation for the last 400 meters before the observation position. The ridgeline above the compound had 2 obvious high points that a defensive element would use if they expected trouble. She studied those 2 points longer than everything else. Then she packed her medical kit in the order dictated by the frequency with which she expected to need each item under pressure. Tourniquet first, hemostatic agents, the needle catheter. Everything else behind those. She added a second tourniquet to the outer pocket of her vest where she could reach it with either hand. Drake, checking his equipment beside her, watched her add the second tourniquet without commenting. She pulled on her jacket. The letter was in the inner pocket. She knew it was there. It was always there. At 03:10 they moved out. The first 90 minutes were quiet. The ridgeline was hard going in the dark. Loose rock underfoot. Temperature in the low 50s before the sun came up. The kind of cold that settled into your joints and made you slow if you let it. She did not let it. Position 4 in the column. Behind Drake, ahead of Nash. The Barrett was with Drake today, slung across his back. No one had said anything formal about the weapon assignment. It was simply understood that if it was needed, Drake would make a call, and the call he would make was now a known quantity. They reached the observation position at 0532. First light beginning at the eastern edge of the sky, pale and tentative. Reeves gave the signal to hold, and the team settled into their positions along the ridge. Arden was 20 meters from the nearest covered position that gave a direct line of sight on the creek bed below. She stayed where she was and watched the compound. At 0549, she heard a safety being clicked into the off position on a weapon close enough to carry on the still morning air. Brief, small, completely distinctive. South ridgeline, above the compound. At the first of the two high points she had studied on the map. She keyed her squadio once. The brevity code for contact imminent. Reeves responded with 2 clicks. Acknowledged. The RP came from the east. It came from a position she had not anticipated. Low from the valley floor from a dry wash that ran parallel to the creek bed. The wash was masked by a low berm of earth that looked like a natural formation on satellite imagery, but was not. Someone had built it. Someone had spent time making the valley floor look like what it was not. The RPG hit 30 meters short of the primary element position, and the blast threw rock and dirt across the ridgeline, and Arden was already moving. She found Raymond Holt at the edge of the blast radius. He was on his back with his right hand pressed to the inside of his right thigh and blood coming through his fingers at a rate that told her everything she needed to know in the first fraction of a second. Femoral artery. She dropped to her knees beside him. Right thigh, he said. His voice was steady. Feels like I know what it is. Don't move. Cat tourniquet out of the outer pocket before she finished speaking. She placed it high on the thigh. Tightened. Watched the bleeding. Tightened again. Not stopped yet. Another rotation on the windlass. The PKM opened up from the south ridge. The first burst went 6 feet over their position. The second burst walked toward them, and the rock next to her head took a round and threw chips across her face, and she did not stop working. She turned the windlass one more full rotation and locked it and looked at the wound and then looked at Holt's face. Pale. Breathing shallow but controlled. Pupils equal. Still present. You're stable, she said. Don't move anything. 2 shooters on the south ridge, he said. PKM is behind the left wall of the first structure. 1 spotter at the second on high point. I know, she said. She looked at the PKM position. 270 meters below, 600 meters laterally along the valley. She had the angle, the distance, the position of the wall, and the gap through which the gunner was firing. The gap was narrow. The shot required going through it rather than around it, a technical problem with a specific solution. Drake was 40 meters north in a half-covered position trying to acquire the PKM target. The angle from his position was wrong. The wall was protecting the gunner from everything Drake could reach. She could see him running the calculation and coming back to the same answer. She keyed the radio. Drake, I need the Barrett. A pause. 20 meters of exposure between us. I know. Fire support is 8 minutes out. She looked at Holt. 8 minutes on the tourniquet was fine. 8 minutes with a PKM working the position was not. Reeves's voice came from 20 meters east, pinned down. I've got 2 men who can't move under that fire. She looked at the PKM position. She looked at the angle. She looked at the gap in the wall. Then she looked at the ground 3 meters to her left. The outcropping, low almost flat to the ridge, a shelf of rock maybe 4 feet wide and 2 feet above the ridgeline surface. From that position, the valley dropped away at precisely the right angle. The wall below would not protect the PKM gunner from a round coming from that shelf, because the shelf was above and east of the gun in a way the gunner had not accounted for in his setup. He had accounted for everything from the valley floor. He had not accounted for the ridgeline above him being occupied. The gap was real. The shot was there. She understood now completely what she had understood partially when she studied the map at 500 that morning. The shelf was 3 meters away. Her left foot was not going to reach it with her. She had known this before she took her position. She had chosen this position knowing what it would cost her because it was the only position from which she could do both things that needed to be done. Her father had crossed 40 meters of open ground in Kuwait in 1991 to reach a man who was going to die without him. He had been shot doing it, and he had continued, and Webb had lived. Then he had come home and spent the next decade putting everything he had learned in those 40 meters into his daughter's hands. She had always understood that the lesson was about courage. She understood now that it was also about math, about the cold, clear calculation that sometimes the only path to the right answer runs directly through the worst possible cost. And the only question that matters is whether you have the preparation to pay it and keep working. She had the preparation. She said to Holt, "Don't let go of the tourniquet." His hand tightened on it. "Go," he said. She moved to the shelf. She applied the second tourniquet to her own left leg first. High, tight, the way her father had taught her to do everything right the first time. No second chances. The windlass ratcheted through its rotations with the mechanical certainty of something that does not negotiate with the person using it. Then she worked. She used the surgical blade from the inner pocket of her kit. She worked with the same deliberate precision she brought to every clinical task. Because precision was not a luxury here, but the only available mercy both for speed and for what came after. She was not a person who did things slowly when speed mattered. She did not make a sound. This is not a heroic detail. It is what happens when training has gone deep enough that the body performs and the mind holds the perimeter of the task, and the sound that would otherwise come does not come because there is no room for it in the architecture of what has to happen next. It took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. When it was done, she had both hands free. She picked up the Barrett, 30 pounds. She dropped onto her stomach on the shelf and found the bipod position and settled the stock against her shoulder, and the motion was completely without hesitation. She put her eye to the scope, 760 meters. The angle was steep enough to require a hold under. The gap in the wall was approximately 18 inches wide at her shooting angle. The PKM gunner had not yet registered the change in threat direction. She had perhaps 3 seconds. She took the breath. She held it. She pressed. The recoil drove into her shoulder. She held her position through it and watched through the scope, and the PKM went silent. She moved the scope to the South Ridge spotter position. The spotter was no longer at the wall. She keyed the radio. "PKM is down. South Ridge spotter has pulled back." Reeves's voice immediate. "Copy. We're moving." She laid the Barrett flat on the shelf. She moved back to Holt. His hand was still on the tourniquet. His color was bad, but his eyes were clear. She got her hands on the wound and worked through a secondary assessment, confirming what the tourniquet had, and had not addressed checking for secondary damage below the arterial injury. She found none. The team maneuvered around her. The valley below went quiet. She kept her hands on Holt. The extraction was clean. The strike package arrived at the compound 11 minutes after contact ended, and the element was already moving north. Holt was ambulatory with support from Nash on his left and Stone on his right, because the tourniquet had held, and she had determined that moving him was less dangerous than staying. She stayed close, monitored his pulse every 4 minutes, watched his color, his breathing, his gait. She talked to him because the conversation gave her continuous data on his cognitive status, and the data stayed consistent all the way to the extraction point. He spoke to her once, his voice directed only at her. "That shot," he said. "Don't talk. Save your energy. The PKM, I know weapons positions." A pause. "That shot shouldn't have been possible from where you were." She watched the ridgeline ahead. It was possible. 760. He was quiet for a moment. "One hand free," he said. "You had one hand on me the whole time." She did not answer. At the extraction point, Reeves stood beside her while they waited for the medevac. He had the expression of a man constructing a formal account of events from the raw material of what had actually happened, running the two versions against each other, and finding significant divergence. He said, "Good work today, Callahan." It was the most he had ever offered. "Thank you, sir," she said. The medevac came in over the ridge, and Raymond Holt was loaded aboard, and Arden stood at the edge of the landing zone and watched the helicopter rise into the pale morning sky. She stood there until the sound of the rotors faded. Then she allowed herself finally to sit down in the dirt. She sat in the dirt of Helmand Province in the early morning light with her medical kit beside her and the valley quiet behind her. And she looked at her hands, both of them resting on her knees, and thought about a gravel road in Montana and a fence post, and an 11-year-old girl learning that the hands can carry what the mind is not yet ready to hold. She thought about her father writing in Kuwait at midnight knowing. She thought about what he had trusted her with and why, and whether he had understood when he wrote the letter that the day he was describing might ask for something he could not have named even if he tried. She thought he probably had. She thought he had written the letter anyway. Drake found the problem 4 days later. He had been working through the operational timeline since the morning after the contact, pulling threads the way he pulled all threads. Quietly, methodically. without announcing what he was doing until he had something worth announcing. He had access through the FOB's intelligence system to the movement logs from the 48 hours preceding the operation, and he had been mapping them against the contact timeline. The pattern was there. The element's route, the specific approach corridor, the timing, the observation position on the ridgeline had been filed with the operations center 71 hours before the mission launched. Standard. The file was accessible to a defined set of people within the chain of command to the CIA liaison element attached to the FOB and to the intelligence section of the forward headquarters. The contact had included an ambush feature requiring advanced knowledge of that route. The dry wash position on the valley floor with its constructed earth berm had been prepared before dawn. Prepared meant time. Time meant someone had been in that valley with shovels and intent because they knew the route and the timing. They had known because someone had told them. Drake narrowed the access list to 9 names. Then he pulled the personnel records for the CIA liaison element at the FOB. One name appeared on both lists. Colonel Warren Pierce, CIA operations officer assigned as liaison to the forward element for the duration of Operation Kunjar. The only member of the CIA liaison team with both the access level required to read the route filing and the direct communication capability to move information outside the coalition network. Drake sat with this for a long time. He documented. He built the structure of the evidence with the same patience with which he had spent 17 years building everything else. When the structure was complete, he took it to Reeves. Reeves made 3 phone calls through channels that did not involve the FOB's primary communications infrastructure. The calls confirmed enough to establish that Pierce had a history of operating in the gray spaces of intelligence work that left trails visible only to people specifically looking for them, and that at least 2 other incidents in the preceding 18 months had involved operational compromises attributed by formal review to other causes. Reeves looked at Drake across the table. This goes up through channels I trust personally. Nothing through Pierce's network. Agreed. This takes more time than we have here. When we rotate out, it comes with us. It came with them. And it moved through the channels Reeves trusted, and it was received and documented and filed in the way that significant things are sometimes filed when the person they implicate is connected enough to make the formal process move at the speed of institutions rather than the speed of urgency. Before Drake's team rotated out, he found Arden in the medical bay and gave her one final thing. He set a small evidence bag on the table. Inside was a USB drive, smaller than she expected, sealed with tape. The label written in her father's left-handed print. It came through official channels with his personal effects analysis, Drake said. A copy. The original was forwarded to your mother in 2004. He paused. You told me you had it. She looked at the bag for a long moment. Then she looked up at him. I haven't opened it, she said. I haven't been ready. I know. He paused. I think you might be now. She took the bag. She opened the drive that night alone in her bunk with a laptop borrowed from the communications officer. Her father's files were organized with the same cramped efficiency as his handwriting. Dated, labeled, nothing wasted. 26 photographs, a 47-second audio file, a handwritten page of field notes. The photographs were low-resolution shot from a distance, but the faces were clear enough. Her father had documented a series of meetings in Kuwait in 2003. A CIA officer meeting with a man her father had identified only as a known regional intermediary with connections to multiple militias. The CIA officer's face appeared in 11 of the 26 photographs. She pulled up Pierce's official biography on the Intelligence Community Personnel Database. The face in her father's photographs and the face in Pierce's official portrait were the same face 15 years apart. She sat with that for a long time. Her father had seen something in 2003 that he did not have a name for yet. He had documented it with the methodical instinct of a Marine Recon operator who understood that information you could not act on immediately was still information worth preserving. He had sealed it inside an ordinary object and sent it home to his family in an ordinary envelope, because he had understood that the formal channels he would otherwise use might be exactly the wrong place for something like this. He had been right. He had been right about everything. She looked at the final photograph. Her father reflected in a vehicle window at the edge of the frame, clearly not the intended subject. He had been trying to document the meeting without being seen. In the reflection, he looked young and alert and slightly too thin the way soldiers always looked in the field. He had died 11 months after taking this photograph. She closed the laptop. She lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling of the bunk room and thought about the distance between 2003 and 2009. Between the photographs her father had taken and the valley where his daughter had paid a price he could not have fully anticipated when he wrote his letter. And whether that distance was a tragedy or simply the shape of how things unfolded when the people responsible for accountability failed to be accountable, she thought it was both. She thought it was going to have to be fixed. Raymond Holt received the envelope on a Tuesday morning in rural Virginia. He was 43 years old, retired from the Navy with the rank of Rear Admiral. He had served 21 years, the last 8 in command positions that had taken him from the Bering Sea to the Persian Gulf and back. He had left active duty in 2022 with a record that was clean and complete and said nothing about the 17 seconds he had spent unconscious on a ridgeline in Afghanistan in 2009, or what he had seen in those 17 seconds, or how it had stayed with him every day since. He ran 5 miles every morning on a route through the edges of his property and back. It was a habit he had developed in his 30s and maintained through 2 decades of deployments in desk rotations in the slow transition from operational leadership to administrative oversight. The running kept him sharp. It also kept him from thinking too much about the things he could no longer do anything about. This morning he returned from the run to find the envelope in the mailbox at the end of the driveway. No return address, his name in block handwriting, thick enough to contain more than a single sheet. He carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, made coffee, drank half the cup standing at the counter, looking out the window at the morning light coming through the trees. Then he sat down and opened it. Inside were 3 items. The first was a medical report from Bagram Airfield Theater Hospital, dated July 14, 2009. Patient Petty Officer Arden A. Callahan, USN. He read it slowly, the way he had learned to read operational documents over 2 decades, looking for what was said and what was not said, and the distance between them. The clinical language was precise and specific and completely clear in its meaning. The admitting physician had documented the wound in careful detail. The injury to the left leg, amputation below the mid-thigh, assessed in the context of the surrounding tissue damage, the absence of any fragmentation evidence, the nature of the incision margins, the specific characteristics that distinguish this wound from blast injury, from ballistic injury, from any external trauma source. The admitting physician's notation at the bottom of page 3, wound consistent with surgical instrument, self-inflicted amputation. Patient presented conscious and cooperative. Patient stated verbatim, "I needed both hands free. No evidence of psychological distress. Patient demonstrates full awareness of procedure and outcome." The psychiatric evaluation, 3 pages later, found Petty Officer Arden Callahan to be fully oriented, cognitively intact, and operating from a rational and deliberate framework. The evaluating physician had noted her explanation with clinical neutrality, patient reports choosing amputation as preferable to the 4 to 6 minutes required for alternative extraction from entrapment, citing concern that this time would result in the death of a severely wounded colleague. The colleague was not named in the report. The final page was a suppression order dated July 22, 2009, signed by Colonel Warren Pierce, Seafarers, a liaison operation, Kanjar. It directed that the admitting physician's notation and the specific findings regarding the nature of the injury be removed from the official record and replaced with standard language of combat wound documentation. The official record would reflect that Petty Officer Callahan sustained severe blast injury to the left lower extremity, consistent with RPG fragmentation. The physician had complied, but the physician had kept a copy. Holt set the medical report down and opened the second document. It was a 40-page operational analysis bound with a binder clip signed by Senior Chief Owen Drake at the bottom of the cover page. A second signature below it, added in 2023, belonged to a senior counterintelligence analyst at the CIA whose name Holt did not know, but whose position told him everything about how long this had been moving through the system and how slowly. He read it the way he had read operational documents for 35 years, systematically, cross-referencing the timeline against the access list, checking the evidentiary chain at each node. The structure was solid. The conclusion was not speculative. Warren Pierce had sold the route of a 7-man SEAL element to a Taliban logistics network in July 2009. Two members of the primary element had not come home from that operation. A 26-year-old Navy corpsman had, in the aftermath of the ambush that resulted, made a surgical decision in the field that no one in the formal record had ever been told the truth about. And the man responsible for all of it was currently before a Senate committee being considered for the second highest position in the American intelligence community. Holt sat at his kitchen table in the morning light. He thought about the 17 seconds between losing consciousness from blood loss and regaining it on the helicopter over Helmand Province. He thought about the image that had persisted from those 17 seconds with the clarity of something branded rather than remembered. A woman kneeling in the dirt with one hand pressed to his thigh and the other hand wrapped around a Barrett M82A1, bringing the rifle to her shoulder from the ground in a single movement that had no wasted motion in it. None at all. He had tried to find her in the months after his recovery. He had tried through every formal channel available to a man of his rank. And the channels had given him a service record that was clean and complete and contained nothing he did not already know and nothing about the nature of her injury or the circumstances surrounding it. The official record said wounded in action. He had accepted this because he had no basis for questioning it other than a 17-second memory from the edge of unconsciousness. He had a basis now. He also had underneath Drake's analysis one final item, a USB drive, small and ordinary, with a handwritten label, a note from Drake paper-clipped to the bag. This belongs to her. She knows what's on it, but you need to know it exists and you need to hear what she tells you about it. Holt picked up the phone. She was at the clinic in Billings on a Thursday morning when her phone rang. The clinic occupied a building that had been a hardware store in a previous life and still had the structural bones of something built to hold heavy things. She saw veterans primarily not by policy but by the nature of her network and the word that traveled among people who had been in difficult places and come back changed. She was finishing a dressing change on a former Army Ranger when the call came through. Virginia area code. Not familiar. She let it go to voicemail. When the Ranger left, she listened to the message. Holt's voice was measured and careful, the voice of someone who had spent decades choosing words because careless words had consequences. He said his name. He said he had received documents he needed to discuss with her. He said he would come to her if she was willing and that he understood if she was not. She sat in the empty clinic for a few minutes. Then she called back. He came to Billings the following week. She met him at a diner 2 blocks from the clinic. He was older than she expected, which was irrational because she had known exactly how old he was. But age is a thing you know in the abstract until you see it in a specific face, and his face carried him 15 years more than the man she had last seen being loaded onto a medevac. The years were in the face, not in the posture. His posture was still military, the physical residue of decades of training that the body does not simply release when the uniform comes off. He sat across from her and placed 3 items on the table. The medical report from Bagram, Drake's analysis, the USB drive with her father's handwriting on the label. She looked at the USB for a moment, then she looked at him. "You didn't open it," she said. "It belongs to you," he said. "But I need you to tell me what's on it." She told him. She told him about the photographs, 26 of them taken in Kuwait in 2003 by a Marine Recon operator who had seen something that did not match its stated architecture and had documented it with the instinct of someone who understood that information worth keeping was information worth hiding well. She told him about the audio file. 47 seconds of a voice she had confirmed through comparison with later public recordings was Pierce. She told him about the field notes her father had written in his cramped left-handed print, detailing dates and locations and descriptions of a pattern he did not yet have a name for. She told him what the cross-reference with Pierce's deployment history produced. Holt was very still throughout. He didn't know the name in 2003, she said. He knew there was a pattern. He knew it was worth preserving. He was dead 11 months later. "And you've had this since 2018. My mother passed that year. I found the watch when I was going through her things." She paused. "I've been watching Pierce's career since Drake sent me his analysis in 2012. Waiting for the right moment and the right person." Holt looked at the USB. "The right person," he said. 35 years of service, former DevGru commander, a rank and a record, and the kind of institutional weight that moves things that don't otherwise move. She looked at him steadily. I couldn't go to a committee anonymously with a dead Marine's photographs in a 47-second audio file. It would have been buried in a week. I needed someone who couldn't be buried. He understood. This is going to cost you something, he said. Yes, pension, clearances, reputation. Everything you built in 35 years gets examined under a different light the moment you attach your name to this. I know. Are you ready for that? He looked at her across the table. This woman who had been 26 years old in a valley in Helmand province and then had made a decision in 3 minutes and 40 seconds that he had spent 15 years carrying the debt of without understanding what it actually was. He said, I've been ready since the morning I woke up on a helicopter over Helmand province and remembered what I'd seen. I just didn't have the right thing to carry until now. He laid his hand flat on the medical report. This goes to the committee. My statement goes with it. Your father's documentation goes with it. Pierce's nomination gets the examination it should have gotten 15 years ago. She was quiet for a long moment. There's one more thing, she said. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Old, worn soft at the creases. My father wrote this in 2003, she said. He was right about everything in it. She did not push it toward him. She simply left it on the table between them. I thought you should know the kind of man he was. Holt looked at the letter. He did not pick it up, but he read what was visible through the first fold. The cramped left-handed print. The date at the top. The way it began. Hey, kid, he looked up at her. His name was Silas Callahan, she said. Gunnery Sergeant Marine Recon. He died in Fallujah in November 2004. He was 48 years old and he was the best person I have ever known. And the man who sold that wrote in 2009 contributed directly to the circumstances that killed him 6 years earlier. She paused. I want that on record. It will be, Holt said. She picked up the letter and put it back in her jacket. Some things you carry for yourself. The record could have the facts. The letter was hers, but there was still one more person who needed to know what she was about to do. She drove to her mother's house that evening, the same house at the end of the gravel road, the same kitchen where she had made a promise 20 years ago. Nora Callahan was 68 years old now. Her hair was white. Her hands showed the wear of decades spent working in a place where winters were not theoretical, but her eyes were the same. Sharp, clear, missing nothing. She made tea while Arden sat at the table. Neither of them spoke until Nora set the cups down and took the chair across from her daughter. You're going to do something, Nora said. It was not a question. Yes, something that's going to make people ask questions about what happened in Afghanistan. Yes, Nora drank her tea, set the cup down, looked at her daughter with an expression that was neither approval nor disapproval, but something older and more complicated. Your father knew this day was coming, she said. He wrote me a letter too. Did you know that? Arden shook her head. He wrote it the same night he wrote yours. He told me that if you ever had to break the promise I made you give, I should be angry for exactly as long as it took me to remember that fear is not the same thing as wisdom, and that the toughest thing I would ever do was let you be the person he raised you to be. She paused. I've been angry for 15 years, not at you, at the world that asked this of you, at the men who made it necessary, at myself for not being strong enough to carry what he carried. She reached across the table and took Arden's hand. But I'm done being angry. Go finish what he started. She stood and walked to the mantel above the fireplace. She took down a small wooden box and brought it back to the table. Inside was a steel trident, tarnished, worn. The pin her father had worn for 14 years. He wanted you to have this, Nora said, when the time came. I think the time has come. Arden took the trident, held it in her palm, felt the weight of it. When you face that man, Nora said, you carry this with you. You make sure he knows whose daughter you are. Arden closed her hand around the trident. I will. The Senate committee received Holt's statement and accompanying documentation on a Monday morning in October. By Wednesday, the confirmation vote for Warren Pierce's nomination as Deputy Director of National Intelligence had been postponed pending review. By the following Monday, the Department of Justice had announced a formal investigation. Pierce appeared before cameras on a Tuesday afternoon and denied everything in the specific and precise language of a man whose lawyers had been preparing that denial for some time. He was calm. He was credible. He called it a politically motivated attack by a disgruntled former officer and a woman with a personal agenda. But he could not explain the wire transfers. He could not explain the 47-second audio file authenticated by 3 independent forensic laboratories. He could not explain why a CIA liaison officer had signed a suppression order on the medical records of a Navy corpsman whose wound had already been documented by the attending physician at Bagram. He could not explain why the root of a 7-man SEAL element had been in the possession of a Taliban logistics network before dawn on July 14, 2009. The committee scheduled a closed session for the following week, and that was when Arden made the call that changed everything. She called Holt on a Wednesday evening. "I need to be in that room," she said. Holt was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do this. My testimony is enough. Your father's evidence is enough. It's not about enough," she said. "It's about who delivers it. This is going to put you in front of people who will ask questions you may not want to answer. I know. They're going to ask about the amputation. They're going to ask why you didn't report Pierce at the time. They're going to try to discredit you. Let them try." Holt was quiet again. Then he said, "You're sure? I've been sure since the day I opened my father's USB drive. I've just been waiting for the right moment." She paused. "The right moment is when I can look Warren Pierce in the face and tell him exactly what he cost. Not through you, not through a document. Me." "All right," Holt said. "I'll make the call." The closed session convened on a gray October morning in a secure room in the Hart Senate office building. The room was smaller than Arden had expected. Long table, 12 chairs, American flag in the corner. The kind of space designed for serious conversations to happen away from cameras and crowds. 7 senators, the committee chairman, a stenographer, 2 legal counsels, and at the witness table, Warren Pierce. He was 60 years old now, gray at the temples, fit for his age, wearing a suit that was expensive without being showy. He had the bearing of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms like this navigating questions from people who thought they were smarter than him and usually were not. He glanced at Holt when the Admiral entered, a brief flicker of recognition quickly suppressed. He did not look at Arden at all, not yet. The chairman called the session to order. He outlined the purpose of the meeting in the flat, bureaucratic language that made everything sound procedural, even when it was not. New evidence had come to light regarding Colonel Pierce's activities during Operation Conjar in 2009. The committee had convened to assess the credibility of that evidence and determine its relevance to the confirmation process. He called Holt first. Holt took the witness chair. He was sworn in. He stated his name and rank and service record for the official transcript. Then he told them what happened on July 14, 2009. He did not editorialize. He did not speculate. He presented the facts the way a man who had commanded SEAL elements for 8 years presents facts. Clearly, sequentially, without emotion. He described the mission, the ambush, the femoral artery wound, the tourniquet applied by Petty Officer Callahan. He described the PKM position that could not be reached from any covered position the element held. He described losing consciousness. He described waking on the helicopter and seeing Arden with one hand on his thigh and the other hand on a Barrett M82A1. He described trying to find her through official channels after his recovery and being told only that she had been wounded in action. He described receiving the envelope 2 weeks ago, the medical report, the suppression order signed by Colonel Pierce. When he finished, the chairman asked, "And you believe the suppression order constitutes evidence of misconduct?" Holt looked directly at Pierce. "I believe it constitutes evidence of a cover-up. And I believe the reason for the cover-up is contained in the operational analysis prepared by Senior Chief Drake, which demonstrates that Colonel Pierce had access to our route and the means to communicate it outside the coalition network." Pierce's lawyer leaned forward to object, but the chairman raised a hand. "We'll hear from Colonel Pierce shortly. First, we have one additional witness." He looked at Arden. "The committee calls Petty Officer Arden Callahan." She stood. She walked to the witness chair. Her blade prosthetic was audible on the floor. Not loud, just present. A soft, rhythmic sound that marked each step. Pierce looked at her for the first time. Something changed in his face. Brief, quickly controlled. But she saw it. Recognition. And underneath that calculation, she was sworn in. She stated her name and service record. The chairman said, "Petty Officer Callahan." Can you describe for the committee what happened on July 14th, 2009? She looked at the 7 senators. Then she looked at Pierce. She told them. She told them about the observation position, the sound of the safety being clicked off, the RPG from the dry wash that should not have been there. She told them about Holt's femoral artery, the tourniquet, the 8 minutes until fire support. She told them about the geometry, the shelf, the gap in the wall. She told them about the decision she made in the 3 seconds she had to make it. She told them about the tourniquet she applied to her own leg, the surgical blade, the 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She told them about the shot, 760 meters, through an 18-inch gap, one hand on Holt, one hand on the Barrett. She told them all of it in the same flat, clear voice she had used on the radio that morning, calling in positions while the valley burned around her. When she finished, the room was completely silent. One of the senators, a woman from Michigan, said quietly, "You amputated your own leg." "Yes, ma'am, because you needed both hands free to make the shot." "Yes, ma'am, and you made the shot." "Yes, ma'am." The senator looked at the medical report in front of her, then she looked at Pierce. "Colonel Pierce," she said, "can you explain why you signed a suppression order, removing this information from the official record?" Pierce's lawyer started to speak, but Pierce held up a hand. He looked at Arden. Then he looked at the committee. The suppression order was signed at the request of the attending physician, who believed that the details of Petty Officer Callahan's injury, if made public, could complicate her recovery and rehabilitation. It was an act of compassion, not misconduct. Arden leaned forward. "That's a lie," she said. The chairman said, "Petty Officer," she did not stop. The attending physician kept a copy of the original report because he knew the suppression order was wrong. He kept it because he knew someone would eventually ask the right questions. "And the reason you signed that order had nothing to do with my recovery and everything to do with the fact that if anyone looked closely at what happened that day, they would start asking how the Taliban knew our route." Pierce's face remained calm, but his hands tightened on the table. "That's speculation." Arden reached into her jacket and pulled out a small bag. She set it on the table. Inside was the USB drive. "This," she said, "contains 26 photographs taken by my father, Gunnery Sergeant Silas Callahan, in Kuwait in March of 2003. They show you meeting with a known Taliban intermediary. They show you building the network you used 6 years later to sell our route." She paused. "My father saw what you were doing. He documented it. He died in Fallujah 11 months later before he could bring it to the right people." She looked at Pierce. "You didn't just betray my team. You built the system that killed my father." Pierce stared at her. The calm was gone now. What remained was something colder. "Your father was a Marine who died honorably in combat. You dishonor his memory by Arden stood." She walked to Pierce's table. The blade prosthetic marked each step. She stopped 3 feet from him. She took the sealed trident from her pocket and placed it on the table in front of him. "Gunnery Sergeant Silas Callahan," she said, "Marine Recon, killed in action. Fallujah, November 2004, 48 years old. He carried this for 14 years. He would have carried it longer if you hadn't spent 2003 building relationships with the same people who put the IED in the road that killed him." She leaned forward slightly. "I kept my hands ready the way he taught me. I made the shot he trained me to make. I saved the man you tried to kill by selling our route." She straightened. "And now I'm standing here in front of this committee with his evidence and my testimony, and I'm telling you that you don't get to hide anymore." Pierce opened his mouth, closed it. The chairman said, "Colonel Pierce, do you have a response?" Pierce looked at the trident on the table. Then he looked at the senators. "I resign my nomination," he said. The chairman blinked. "I'm sorry," Pierce stood. "I resign my nomination effective immediately. This committee can do what it wants with these allegations. I will not participate further." He walked out. His lawyer followed, objecting into a phone. The room sat in stunned silence for 10 seconds. Then the chairman said, "This session is adjourned." Arden picked up the trident, put it back in her pocket. Holt was standing near the door. He caught her eye, nodded once. She nodded back. Outside, the October sky was gray and cold. Arden stood on the steps of the Senate building and looked out at the street. Holt came and stood beside her. "He resigned," Holt said. "For now, the DOJ investigation will continue." "I know." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Holt said, "What you did in there, I did what my father taught me," she said. "I kept my hands ready. I made the shot. I came home, so, She looked at him. "Thank you for giving me the room to do it." Holt shook his head. "You didn't need me to give you anything. You just needed someone to open the door." She smiled, small, brief. Then she walked down the steps and got into the car that would take her to the airport. By the time she landed in Billings, the news had broken. Pierce's resignation, the DOJ investigation, the allegations of betrayal dating back to 2003. Her phone had 17 missed calls by the time she turned it back on. She ignored all of them. She drove to her mother's house. Nora was waiting on the porch. Arden got out of the truck and walked up the steps, and her mother pulled her into a hug without saying anything. They stood like that for a long time. Then Nora said, "He would be so proud of you." Arden closed her eyes. "I know." 6 months later, on a cold morning in March, Arden stood at the front of a classroom in the VA Medical Center in Billings. 18 folding chairs. Everyone occupied. The people in them were young, mid-20s mostly. They wore the particular alertness of people who had been places that made them sit forward when someone at the front of the room started talking, because they had learned that what the person at the front of the room knew might be the difference between someone going home and someone not. She picked up the marker and wrote on the whiteboard, "Heal when you can, fight when you must." She stood back and looked at it. Then she turned to face the room. "We're going to start with the femoral artery," she said. "Not because it's the most common injury you'll see, because it's the one that doesn't wait for you to be ready, because it takes a person from stable to dead in 90 seconds if you don't know what you're doing. And knowing what you're doing means your hands already know before your brain has finished assessing the situation." In the third row, a young corpsman named Merrick Abrams wrote the words from the whiteboard into his notebook. She walked the room as she talked. She used the volunteers in the front 2 rows to demonstrate tourniquet application. She talked about timing. She talked about the difference between the textbook and the field, and the specific ways the field would try to make the textbook irrelevant and what you held on to when that happened. She talked about the difference between what your hands know and what your mind is ready to accept, and how in the worst moments of your life, your hands will be ahead of your fear if you have trained them properly, and how that gap between the hands and the fear was where the work was done. She did not talk about herself. She never did. The lesson was the lesson, and the person standing at the front of the room was only its delivery mechanism, and the only thing that mattered was whether it arrived intact in the people sitting in the chairs. The room was very quiet when she said these things. After the class, she returned to her office and found a letter on her desk. It was from Army Human Resources Command, addressed to her full name and rank and current address. 3 paragraphs of formal language that said in the particular bureaucratic grammar of military commendations that due to new information brought to official attention, the record of Petty Officer Arden Callahan's service on July 14, 2009 had been reviewed and updated, and that her existing Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal was to be replaced by the Bronze Star with Valor effective immediately, and that a formal ceremony would be arranged at her convenience. She read it twice. She thought about Holt sitting in a Virginia farmhouse, opening an envelope that had no return address. She thought about Drake's 17 years in special operations, building an evidentiary structure with the same patience he brought to everything. She thought about her father taking 26 photographs in Kuwait in 2003 with a camera hidden in a watch, because he had understood that the only reliable archive was the one you built yourself and kept close. She thought about all the people who had done the right thing slowly over years, at a cost that varied and accumulated toward a resolution that was never clean but was finally, after 15 years, something that could be called a resolution. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer of her desk at the clinic. Not because it did not matter, because some things matter in a way that does not require display. The drawer already held the curriculum proposal from Garrett Stone, and those 2 pieces of paper in that ordinary drawer were enough of a record for her purposes. The world could keep the ceremony. Stone's letter had arrived 2 weeks after the Senate hearing. It was 2 pages. The first page was the formal cover letter for a curriculum proposal submitted to the VA, a proposal to develop Arden's integrated combat medicine program into a standardized training module for corpsmen and medics seeking advanced certification, to be piloted in 3 VA districts in the first year and expanded nationally pending evaluation. The cover letter was professional and precise and made a clear and well-constructed argument for the proposal's merit. The second page was handwritten. The handwriting was careful in the way of someone who does not often write by hand and wanted to get this right. It said, "I was wrong about you from the first day. Not wrong in the way of a man who lacks information. Wrong in the way of a man who had information and chose not to use it because using it would have required him to adjust something he'd already decided. That's a worse kind of wrong, and I knew it at the time and I did it anyway. I'm not going to ask you to accept an apology for that. An apology is a thing you ask someone else to carry. I'm going to do something useful instead. This program is the right thing. I've seen what happens to young operators who go into the field without integrated training, and I've seen what you can do and what you can teach. And the distance between those two things is the distance between people coming home and people not coming home. If you'll let me help build this, I will. Whatever it needs, however long it takes." Stone, she had read it the morning it arrived, standing at the clinic window with her coffee going cold in her hand. And she had thought about a man who had said nothing in a valley when she had earned the right to hear something, and who had spent the intervening years arriving at the only apology worth anything. She had called him that afternoon. "I got your letter," she said. A pause. "And yes," she said, "come help build it." He was there the following Monday. That evening she called her mother. Nora answered on the second ring, which was how she always answered, and asked how the classes were going, because she had started asking about the classes the way she had never quite managed to ask about the deployments. With the genuine curiosity of someone who was proud of a thing they had been afraid of for a long time and had finally found a way to stop being afraid of it. They talked for an hour. Arden told her about Stone, about the curriculum proposal, about the 18 students in the Thursday class, and the way Merrick Abrams had written the words from the whiteboard without being asked. She told her about Holt and the committee and the investigation that was moving at the speed of institutions, but was moving. She told her all of it because she had started telling her mother all of it after the testimony became public, and there was nothing left to protect her from. And because Nora Callahan had turned out to be, as Silas had always said, the toughest woman he had ever known, and she understood more than she let on. Near the end of the call, her mother said, as she had started saying in the months since Holt's name appeared in the news reports, "Your father would have done the same thing." Arden looked out the clinic window at the dark Montana sky. At this altitude, the stars were very clear, very numerous. The kind of sky you only got when you were far enough from everything else that the ambient light of the world did not reach. "I know," she said. "That's why he taught me." She said goodnight. She stood at the window for a while after the phone still in her hand. The clinic was quiet around her. The whiteboard at the front of the room still had her writing on it from the morning session. "Heal when you can, fight when you must." And she looked at it in the dark from across the room and thought about legacy the way her father had thought about it. Not as the thing you do, but as what the thing you do becomes after you are done. The 18 students from Thursday's class would go into the field carrying something she had given them. They would give it to the people they saved. Those people would go home because of it. Some of those people would be fathers. Some of them would have daughters. They would teach things to them carefully over years, putting knowledge into small hands, with the understanding that the hands would know what to do when the moment arrived, even if the mind was not yet ready. That was the chain. That was how it worked, not in the formal record, not in the certificates in the drawer, but in the accumulation of prepared hands moving through the world doing the work. She turned from the window. On her desk was a folder. The briefing package for a consultation Stone had requested through a mutual contact. A training assessment for a forward medical element deploying in the spring. She would read it in the morning. She would bring him into the conversation by the end of the week. There was work to do, as there was always work to do, and the work was where the meaning lived. Not in the finished products of it, but in the doing. She turned off the clinic light. She locked the front door. She walked to her truck in the parking lot under the Montana stars. Her blade prosthetic was quiet on the asphalt, her stride even and unhurried. The walk of someone who had stopped thinking about the walking and was simply moving the way you stop thinking about breathing once you trust your body to manage it. She drove home on the road that ran along the edge of the valley with the mountains visible to the west. The last light gone from their peaks, the high snow carrying a faint luminescence that had nothing to do with the stars, and everything to do with the simple fact of elevation. She had grown up looking at those mountains. She had learned to read weather from them. She had stood at the back of a property at the end of a gravel road and looked at them over the barrel of a Remington 700, while her father stood behind her and said, again, and she had understood even then without words for it, that what he was teaching her was not how to shoot. He was teaching her how to stay, how to hold your position when everything in you wants to move, how to keep your hands steady on the thing that matters most when the thing that matters most is the hardest thing in the room to hold on to. How to absorb the cost of a decision and keep working because the decision and the work are two different things, and only one of them is finished when you make the choice. She had learned it. She had used it. She was still using it. She pulled into the driveway of her house, small on the east side of Billings, close enough to the clinic that she could walk when the weather allowed. She sat in the truck for a moment after turning off the engine, looking at the dark front of the house. She thought about her father's letter. She thought about the sentence near the end. And then come home and call your mother, and she will be angry, and then she will understand because she is the toughest woman I have ever known. He had been right. Her mother had been angry, and then she had understood. And then slowly over the years, since the testimony became public and the story became something Nora Callahan could hold, as something other than loss, she had become something Arden had not fully anticipated and could not have predicted when she was 26 years old, making a decision in a field with a surgical blade and a tourniquet and 47 seconds left to act. She had become proud, not in the flag on the coffin way, not in the ceremony way, in the private, in daily way of a woman who looks at her daughter and understands finally and completely what her husband had known all along, that the thing he had put in their daughter's hands was not a burden, and not a weapon, and not an inheritance of grief. It was a way of being in the world that made the world better for the people in it. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Arden got out of the truck. She went inside. She made tea in the kitchen and stood at the counter while it steeped. She thought about the briefing folder on her desk. She thought about Stone showing up Monday with a notebook and a willingness to work. That was the most genuine thing he had ever offered her. More genuine than the letter even. Because the letter was one moment and the showing up was every day since, and every day since was harder and more honest than any single moment could be. She thought about Merrick Abrams writing the words from the whiteboard without being asked because he had already understood at 24 years old that the things worth keeping were worth writing down. She thought about a field in Helmand Province in the morning light, in a helicopter rising into the pale sky, and the long distance between that morning and this one. Not in miles and not in years, but in the slow accumulation of things that had been done right, and people who had been brought home and knowledge that had been passed forward into hands that would use it. She drank her tea, she rinsed the cup, she went to bed. Outside, the Montana night settled into its full quiet. The stars over high country in March simply being present in the darkness without requiring anything in return. In the morning, there would be work. There was always work. She had been taught to be ready for it. She was.